Hello, here in Israel, it's early morning. In America, I know it's the night. I'm so pleased to join you here tonight, moving towards the conclusion of the Global Health and Halacha Conference. And this Health and Halacha Conference has been in so many ways not just a celebration of communities coming together to understand the interaction between health, mental and physical, and halacha, but it's also been an opportunity to start to see some of the fruits of the Yoatzot Halacha and what we've learned over the years, and Bezrat Hashem, what we can contribute working with great professionals from our community and helping to educate our community. Our goal tonight today, is to take you behind the scenes a little bit in the Yoatzot Halacha project to discuss how we worked with our guide and co-founder, Rav Yehuda Herzl Henkin ZTL, my teacher, my rabbi, and the rabbi and teacher of all of the Yoatzot Halacha, who is responsible fundamentally for the halachic DNA of the program. What I want to do is to try to understand something about Rav Henkin and his approach to halacha. I want to talk about what elements of that approach to halacha came into the fore when he was working with Yoatzot Halacha. I want to give you, like I said, some behind the scenes details, and I want to push that legacy forward by communicating to you some of the ideas about halacha that perhaps you can take with you beyond this talk. So to get started, we need a little bit of background, and I would call this a Gadol story with a twist. What do I mean? Well, let's start with the Gadol story. Rav Henkin was the grandson of Rav Yosef Eliyahu Henkin ZTL, who was one of the foremost poskim of the 20th century. In America, he worked for a while. He was the lead posek side by side with Rav Moshe Feinstein. Also, when Rav Moshe Feinstein came on the scene, Rav Yosef Eliyahu Henkin had his own great halachic legacy and weight, which is still not as widely known as perhaps it ought to be. Rav Henkin, of course, knew it, and he studied intensively with his grandfather in America before he made Aliyah in 1971. What do I mean that he studied intensively with his grandfather? Well, it's not just sitting and studying. He did what we call shimush talmidei chachamim. The Talmud tells us in Sota that heichi damid chasid shoteh, what is a kind of a pious fool? Ula says it's someone who learned the text of the Tanakh. It's someone who learned Mishnah, who learned halachic teachings, but did not come to the point of really apprenticing himself to a sage, to sages. Itmar, further the Gemara says, it was said, someone who learned Tanakh and halachot and did not have the opportunity to apprentice with Talmidei Chachamim, Rabbi Elazar Amer, Hareze Ama Aretz. This is someone who's basically an ignoramus, or Nachmani Amar is a bore, like the English word bore, B-O-R-O-R, someone who's boorish. And they go on, this is like a sorcerer. How like a sorcerer? Because just like sorcerers kind of utter incantations and don't know what they're talking about, so too someone who hasn't learned with the Talmid Chacham, because it's through learning with the Talmid Chacham, as Rashi explains there, it's through learning with the Talmid Chacham that you understand the reasons for things, the real reasons behind halachot and the reasons behind rulings, that you really have depth to your teaching. And Rav Henkin, in some ways, was an autodidact. We'll talk a little bit more about his educational background soon. He was a student of his father, who was certainly a Talmid Chacham. He went to Yeshiva Flatbush, which had a Kodesh curriculum. There's a lot of his learning that Rav Henkin acquired on his own. But this essential element that pushed Rav Henkin to become a posek, or to have some of the knowledge of what it would be to be a posek, this halachic DNA that eventually has made its way down to the Yoatzot Halacha, that's coming from his grandfather. And that's why even after he established himself, after his Aliyah, as a halachic authority of the highest order, And he comes to Israel, and he becomes right away the regional rabbi of the Beit Shan Valley and of the southern Golan. Even after he establishes himself in his writings, Rav Henkin publishes works of responsa, and he titles them Bnei Banim. Bnei Banim, meaning the grandchildren. The grandchildren are like children, or really, this even to me, I always think of another Gemara. This one's in the Masechet Brachot, where it says that anyone who teaches their child Torah, the verses consider that person to be as though they received the Torah straight from Sinai, because the verse says, you'll teach the words of Torah to your children and your children's children. It's not just children, it's also grandchildren. It's written afterwards, the day you stood before Lord your God at Horeb. I have always felt that Rav Henkin's personal Har Sinai is not just his father, but it's very much his grandfather. So that's some of the Gadol story. To give you more of a sense of the Gadol story, we have to also talk a little bit about Rav Henkin's work ethic. Rav Henkin was very modest. He would say something like, he'd use the language of having inherited few of his grandfather's talents, except for really, quote, delivering himself to clarifying the truth of halacha, end quote. But really, Rav Henkin's dedication was unparalleled. When I'm dealing, he wrote, with the responsum, I think about it when I'm dreaming and when I'm awake, when I walk on the way and when I lie down and when I rise up. I get up from the middle of a meal and I get down from my bed in the middle of the night in order to go and look again in a book or to write down some new idea, because it's like a fire burning in my bones. So there's authenticity to this Gadol story, the story about Rav Henkin and viewing him as a sage, and certainly the many letters of approbation that his works received, the way in which his works are quoted in halachic literature, attest to that. There's still, like I said, there's a twist. And what's the twist? Rav Henkin was, in a certain sense, a product of an American Jewish childhood. You could even, in some ways, say American modern Orthodox childhood. At least he went to, like I said, Yeshiva Flatbush. And we don't necessarily have that many poskim in the modern Orthodox community, but coming, or from even the centrist Orthodox community, coming from within that community and achieving the heights of being a posek from America, there are relatively few in number who have written extensive works of tshuva, of tshuvot, shelot tshuvot, responsa, from that background. And when I say that background, I should go a little farther. Rav Henkin was an Ivy League graduate. He had a master's in sociology. He disrupted his master's study to learn with his grandfather, but he did complete it. And we see we see some aspect of this element, this twist, to Rav Henkin's gadlut, to his greatness, already starting with some of the questions that he takes up in earnest in his tshuvot. Questions about young mothers coming into shul, or the husband attending delivery for labor, mixed seating at a simcha, holding one's wife's hand in public, talis and tefillin for women, the importance of women reciting Shmoneh Esrei, discussion of women reciting Marv, women in Kaddish, something that he picked up and took a step beyond the discussion that we see in his grandfather's works. Kvod Sibur, the dignity of the congregation and how that interacts with women reading text for the congregation, including the Megillah. When a couple can decide that they want to stop having children, women zimun, women in Sheva Brachot, the husband and wife in minhagim, in their customs, who has to take up the customs of whom, early abortion, whether a woman's name could be the mother's name is mentioned in the ketubah. You'll notice that the examples I chose had to do with women. I mean, it's only a fraction of the things that he talked about. He talked about a lot of modern issues. In particular, he had an interest in issues that pertain to very, very important modern questions in Israeli society as well. And yet, the prominence, I think, of the women's issues here is also a testimony to where he was coming from, what he brought with him. He was marrying the legacy of his grandfather in his approach to halacha with a deep understanding of the community to which he was responding. And the list really does go on. The hallmarks of how he's dealing with these questions consistently is he's looking at the real questions that are arising in a grassroots way from the public, and he's handling them not just with honesty, but with seriousness off the get-go. When he's talking to a woman who's asking about talit or tefillin, and whether she can wear them, outside of the question of how he resolves things, there's the question of how he relates to her. And what we don't see in the way he relates to this woman is a questioning of her motives, of why she would ask this question. It's clear to Rav Henkin that she's asking this question because she's interested. This particular woman is interested in taking on more Torah and mitzvot, and a hallmark of his rulings. And this is not just rulings pertaining to women, this is rulings pertaining to everybody. A hallmark of his rulings is taking real questions and questioners seriously. He's bringing halacha to bear. He's understanding deeply where they're coming from, and he's really relating to them where they are. Just another drop on the feminist, on the women's questions, or the volume of them. One could ask, well, was Rav Henkin a feminist? It's not the way in which I think he thought. He didn't walk around saying, am I fitting into some ideological category? That's not his approach to halacha. His central approach to halacha is his grandfather's approach. At the same time, that halacha is determinative of how he's resolving the questions that are being brought to him. There was once someone who wrote about Rav Henkin's approach to Psak, and Rav Henkin responded, among other things, to this person saying that Rav Henkin's rulings showed an absence of feminist critique. And Rav Henkin, this is back to, kind of the twist, things that made Rav Henkin different. Rav Henkin's response was not to deny or to embrace this charge. His response was simply to say, there are a variety of feminist critiques, from moderate to radical, in his writings. He wasn't saying if he thought that was good or bad, and he wasn't saying that was the thing that drove him. I think the real question was being raised was, is a feminist agenda driving you? No, a feminist agenda wasn't driving him. Halacha, getting to the truth, Yirat Shamayim, this was driving him, but he certainly would express, and he did, for example, in Equality Loss, he quotes it himself there where he's responding to this, as we know, separate is not equal. Restricting women's physical place to the home or other private arenas effectively circumscribes her role and status in society. This is not a criticism of halacha. This did not take over the halachic discussion, but there's an implicit acknowledgement, and sometimes explicit acknowledgement in his work, that he has to grapple with that sort of a question. Okay, so Rav Henkin he's bringing the legacy of his grandfather to bear on the modern world, and he's particularly attuned to the questions that are being brought to him, including the questions being brought to him by women. The next question I think that we would have to ask is, well, how did he do it? Not just how did he learn? We know he said day and night he's thinking about the questions. How is he answering the question? How is he approaching halacha? He would say, and I'm quoting him again, a halachic decision typically combines pure halachas that is derived solely from studying the sources with mitziyut, the reality, or facts on the ground. Bridging the gap between the two requires hora'ah, ruling. Taking a step back from what Rav Henkin is saying, he's saying there's the world and there's halacha in principle or in the books. And what the posek needs to do is to bridge the perceived gap, to show how these are fitting together. And he then explains how there are different rules for how you do that. There can be difficult circumstances, shatat chak, or material loss. Quote, halacha takes into account the possibility of negative consequences of ruling as well, whether these be the replacement of heretofore uninformed noncompliance by willful flouting of the law, or the weakening of rabbinic prestige, or concomitant influence by issuance of rulings that appear overly radical or strange and are therefore likely to be rejected. Whatever their scholarly weight may be, These are just examples. I make no attempt to list all the many factors involved. So he listed already 4 factors. You could call them meta factors. It's not meta. These are built into the halachic system. These are just some of the many examples in which halacha is very nuanced and very highly attuned to real life, or to the exigencies of real life. Or if you're building a bridge between halacha and real life, you have to understand the ways in which halacha doesn't always map itself on to life the same way, even the same halacha in a different situation. A context can make all the difference in how to apply a halachic ruling. And then he continues and he says, Hara'ah, particularly in communal affairs, is by nature an art rather than a science. Besides scholarship, the posek needs the intangibles of intuition and insight, experience and common sense. Beyond that, the community and history determine whose opinions are accepted, whose are not. It's an art rather than a science. How do you practice an art? Well, there was his hard work and his thorough research. When Rav Henkin would research a topic, it wasn't what a lot of people do with research, especially, this was before the computer for the most part. He had a vast library with a tremendous emphasis on early halachic sources. There are different topics on which he'll quote an early halachic source where it's hard to find anyone else who noticed sometimes that source existed before Rav Henkin brought it into play in the discussion, and then it becomes a central factor in future discussion following that. He was very interested in thoroughly seeing what all the early authorities would do in their interpretation of a text, and he would go through the text. He describes himself as taking many passes through a Talmudic text and the basic halachic text regarding a question, again and again, deepening it until he would come up with sort of an overall sense of what was really going on. I think you see this in the great halachic authorities. You see almost a narrative quality in how they put together different, sometimes on the face of it, even conflicting information, and they weave together the different sources to tell what I would almost call a halachic story that it's not so much as having a beginning, middle, and end as having an overall cohesion, which is hard to see. And once you see it, when it's really good, it's convincing. It's so compelling the way it arises from the sources that it's convincing. And this is what Rav Henkin would do. He would work in particularly emphasizing the early halachic authorities, read and read and read, return and return and return to the sources until he had a picture of what was going on, so that when you read his tshuvot, you know that someone's behind the steering wheel at all times. He might take interesting turns or digressions, but throughout there's the sense that not that there's a predetermined outcome, but there's a sense that there's a mind grasping the overall situation. One of the key tools that Rav Henkin would employ in order to do this was attention to detail, precision, nuance. Rav Henkin was a man with incredible level of sensitivity to text. The difference between a preposition here and a lack of preposition there, how something was phrased, he could compare two texts, see that difference, and understand how it might reflect a deep underlying conceptual difference. Many of Rav Henkin's psakim rely on him reading texts with such almost with tweezers, with such finely pinpointed tools that he's able to see opportunities, options, ideas where other people didn't even notice them. So that sometimes it sounds as though he's saying something new, but he's founding what seems novel in a very, very close textual reading, which again is convincing, which is loyal to the text, which emerges from being familiar, deeply familiar with the very subtle variations between the different ways of formulating a point. Rav Henkin was also fearless. Torah and mitzvot were Rav Henkin's bottom line. He learned that from his grandfather. And when there was something that needed to be said, Rav Henkin would say it. Now, how he would say it was very carefully weighed, the same way that he was attuned to the precisions of text inside what he read, the early sources. He was also attuned to the precision to the use of words, to nuance in everything that he wrote. He was very, very careful, and everything that he said, frankly, he was careful when he spoke as well. He took that great care, but what he said was clear and honest and never looking to curry favor. These are points that we'll come back to. Rav Henkin was a master of understatement. He would say things subtly, again, nuanced, but it would be there. If you looked closely, you'd see it all. But it was still somehow very, very clear. And we'll talk in a minute about how he passed on clarity to the Yoatzot Halacha. Rav Henkin was also never afraid to revisit a topic. He could learn something and he could come back to it and back to it and back to it again and again and again, not just when first researching it. That was already unusual, but he could research a topic and write about it and years later come back to it completely fresh, never letting it go or constantly being on the lookout for a new piece of information which might help him put the puzzle of what our sources were getting at together in a different way to help him get closer to halachic truth. Rav Henkin was never afraid to look back at something he had said before. If he thought he had been mistaken, he'd say he was mistaken. But often what would happen is he'd find a new level, another idea. He'd deepen what he saw. And when I say deepen what he saw, I almost felt sometimes like he had a sort of 3D vision. By 3D vision, I mean, he didn't just see what was on the page. He would see what was between the lines. He would see what wouldn't be said. You would see what needed to be said. This 3D vision, it was a real grasp of the situation. You see this in many great halachic authorities, or even in commentaries, let's say, to Torah. They're the commentaries that they're talking about Tevat Noach, Noah's Ark from the outside. And they're the ones that you almost feel like they were imagining themselves inside the Ark. They understood what animals were there and when they needed to be fed and how Noach had to feed them. I felt like Rav Henkin saw halachic questions with that level, with that high level of resolution. Just an example, I mentioned before that he wrote a tshuva at one point, an early tshuva, about women, young mothers being able to attend shul and how to weigh and what to do with children in shul. And the tshuva includes a recommendation for babysitting, because it wasn't enough for Henkin to just think about the halachic principles involved in what you were going to do. He also thought very, very much inside the question, well, what's going to be practical? What's going to work for the people that I'm talking to? So there's this, and I should also add, as modest as he was, there was also just a tremendous gift, not just an intellectual gift, a gift of perception. It's hard to pass something like that on. So how do you pass on an art and not a science? Or finally, let's get to the heart of what we want to talk about, which is, now that we have some sense of what Rav Henkin was doing, how did he move that forward with Yoatzot Halacha? Tova Gendel, one of the earliest Yoatzot Halacha, when I told her that I was preparing this talk, said, I'm going to quote her in Hebrew and I'll translate, "Heitachsuta tovanit elenu הייתה ביטוי לכבוד שהוא רכש לנו כבר מראשית הדרך." His demanding relationship with us was an expression of the respect that he had for us already from the beginning of the journey. ההנחה הייתה שלא עושים כאן הנחות, כי אין סיבה. His assumption was that you don't give any discounts, you don't make it easier for Yoatzot Halacha and talking about halacha because we're women, because there's no reason to. That fundamental respect that we mentioned when it came to dealing with women's halachic questions, when they came to him, when they sent it to him, not just women's, men's, anyone's halachic questions, he had that same fundamental respect when it came to his expectations. I apologize for the gap. And just as we're getting to the meat of things, okay, let's get back into things. So we were asking how Rav Henkin passed on the art of psika to the Yoatzot Halacha, the art, or just the art of understanding halacha to Yoatzot Halacha. Different Yoatzot Halacha are at different levels. So Rav Henkin, first of all, in the beginning, he actually, before there were Yoatzot Halacha, he used to teach at Nishmat. Over the years, in particular with his illness, that became less and less common. But he helped found the program, and he was instrumental. He was a partner in founding the program with Rabbanit Henkin and Rav Yaakov Varhavdik. And he was involved in shaping policy for the program from the beginning. He was the one who wrote the original text of certification the Yoatzot Halacha would receive, and it was his idea, from what I understand, that originally Yoatzot Halacha were only given permission to advise women on halacha for 10 years, and then following the end of that 10-year period, there was supposed to be a reevaluation. And that was something that he did because of his great concern that on the one hand, it was clear to him that the institution of Yoatzot Halacha was urgent, essential, and on the other hand, he wanted to make sure that there was going to be a way to ensure the integrity of the project and have a course correction if there should be any particular issue. And Rav Henkin was the posek alongside Rav Yaakov Verhaftig for the Yoatzot Halacha, acting in helping us resolve or respond to women consulted by Yoatzot worldwide right up until the days before his death, where he was very heavily engaged in our response to the COVID pandemic. Another way that he connected with Yoatzot Halacha was through the Bechina, the test. When a woman would finish her studies in Karen Ariel, she would be tested by a panel of oral tests of rabbis giving her oral tests, and among them was Rav Henkin. And Rav Henkin's test was known for being particularly demanding because he would do what was called an unseen. He'd give you a text that you'd never seen before, and he'd ask you to learn it alongside him, to explain it, and then he'd discuss it with you. In my case, I remember it vividly. He brought a text that showed a different perspective on the issue of stainings from what we had learned in the program, a more stringent perspective. And I think he did that in a deliberate effort to make it clear, in my case, that there were other ways of looking at the halacha aside from what we had learned. And even if we had learned one perspective, or even the range of perspectives we had learned, this viewpoint, as unusual as it was something that had to be taken into account. I think he wanted to see the ability to hold, as he did, a lot of different points of view in mind at once and respect them and navigate that. A more recent Yoatzot Halacha was telling me how much it meant for her to be tested by him. She comes into the room, he gives her a new test, and then he got into a conversation with her. He asks, "What about a husband and wife playing tennis? Is that permissible during Nida?" She didn't know what to answer. So he walked her through it in analysis. Well, what is tennis? What's happening? Step by step. How does that relate to the halachot of different distancing behaviors during Nida? And then he moved on to, when you're sitting together, you went to a show. Can you share an armrest? Questions that are really very deeply rooted in our world. And in the Bechina, she said it was a great learning opportunity for her, and it was an experience for her seeing how he was taking the knowledge that she had and applying it practically to areas that she hadn't thought about as practically before. Another way that Rav Henkin connected and guided Yoatzot Halacha was over the phone. Yoatzot Halacha Michal Ronis wrote a whole piece in the Times of Israel about what it meant to know that you always had access to a world-class posek who had your back and could always guide you. I had that experience more than once. A rabbi would call up and ask about Rav Henkin's position on something, and I would say something along the lines of, "Well, I think it's this, but let me call him and get back to you." And the Rav would be in shock, and 5 minutes later, I'd call the Rav back because I'd discussed it with Rav Henkin. The idea that we had that level of assumed immediate access to a gadol, to really a great posek all the time, was a tremendous boon to all of us. It gave us confidence in everything we did. And at the same time, Rav Henkin was also always working to help us all get our standing on our own halachic feet. An anecdote of this, Ora Derovin, a Yoatzot Halacha, shared with me an anecdote of when she called Rav Henkin once with a woman who had been married for 10 years and had just taken a refresher course in Taharat Mishpacha. And she had never heard of the concept of a moch dachuk, which is a particular type of exam ideally performed prior to counting the clean days. And she wanted to ask Rav Henkin, she wanted to ask the Yoatzot Halacha, Ora, about what to do, because on the one hand, she wanted to follow halacha properly. On the other hand, she hadn't been doing this for 10 years, and she was frankly intimidated. She didn't know what to do with this. And Ora didn't know quite how to respond to her. She didn't want this woman to feel that her prior observance of the halacha was inadequate. She didn't want this woman to feel pressured to take on a practice, which, while ideal, there are a number of situations in which it's not fully obligatory, and at least under duress. And Ora called Rav Henkin for guidance. Now, Rav Henkin, when you would call him or consult him, like I said, he was very careful with his words, choosing them, and you felt like you could hear him thinking. He'd take his time answering you. There would be long silences, and in those moments, it was as though he was going through everything in his head before he would say anything. He wouldn't just start talking like some people do and find his way to what he wanted to say while he was talking. You would wait there and he would think it through. And when he had a clear thought, that's when he would share it with you carefully. And in this case, Rav Henkin said to her, tell her to try it once and see how it goes for her. And if she's able to do it and it works out, then she should continue. And if there's a problem, you can discuss what the problem is. And it might be that she'll fall under that category of people who are in some sort of duress or able to drop this particular practice. For Ora, the suggestion was a revelation. It seems so simple and intuitive, but it's not obvious. And she shared it with the woman, and the woman was so relieved. Here was an opportunity for her to, on the one hand, follow through on the new halachic knowledge that she had acquired, and on the other hand, to feel safe and not threatened by venturing into new halachic waters. She felt heard. Let's get back to how Rav Henkin worked with Yoatzot Halacha and helped convey that art of helping people feel heard. And I want to talk now in the framework of the written word, which was a specialty of Rav Henkin, and which was really the focus of my work with Rav Henkin. I had the privilege of being one of the Yoatzot Halacha who worked on the Yoatzot.org, our website. I worked with Rav Henkin on the site for over 17 years, being in regular contact with him online. And these years absolutely shaped me, were formative for me, and have been formative for any woman who's worked with him in this capacity. Later on, when Nishmat Habayit was written, Rav Henkin also was very hands-on, working to help shape and develop the Yoatzot Halacha and their approach to Halacha as they worked on the project, as he was improving what they were putting out. I'm going to give you a sample question, and I want to talk a little bit about how this was a question that we dealt with early on in my work on the site. This was one of these comments. He made a comment here that stayed with me for my whole life. And there's also an interesting tension that gets highlighted by this question. This question went like this: I'm unmarried and haven't been to a mikveh. However, for other personal spiritual reasons, I'd like to immerse. The reasons have nothing to do with sexual relations, rather to set right something I feel was wrong from many years ago. May I go to the mikveh at any time? Should I follow the laws of Nida and count the 7 white days? It's an interesting question. It's not a standard Nida question. I should say that we've had a good number of questions like this over the years. A woman going to the mikveh while single is not a simple matter. There was a rabbinic decree at one point made to discourage in the Middle Ages, made to keep women from doing this out of concern that single women going to the mikveh might lead to some level of promiscuity. Now here's the thing: before even I as being expected to draft a response to this question, and then Rav Henkin would be supervising it and reviewing it and commenting on it. Now I was expected to know about Rav Henkin's work. Now in this case, Rav Henkin actually wrote a beautiful, brilliant tshuva, not on this specific question, but on a related question, talking about Tevila before Yom Kippur, or Rosh Hashanah. There he masterfully, as he often does, lays out three main approaches to why it would be important for someone to immerse in the mikveh prior to Yom Kippur. In particular, one would be for tshuva, one would be for ritual impurity, and one would be to resemble the angels. I just want to say as an aside, but that's my favorite point in this tshuva is probably that, where I'm going to quote the official English translation of the tshuva in the interest of time. Rav Henkin says, the assumption that women cannot resemble the angels on Yom Kippur is itself problematic. It's very diplomatic language, it's called problematic. As its source, the Achronim cite, because he was careful with language, as its source, the Achronim cite Yalkut Shimoni, based on Vayikra Rabbah, that, quote, angels are all males, there is no female among them, end of the quote. And Rav Henkin says, I think that is no proof, however, for we are not trying to emulate the angel's masculine qualities, but only what pertains to Yom Kippur. And then he quotes Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, then Yom Kippur, just as the angels are barefoot, the people of Israel are barefoot. The angels don't bend, the people of Israel stand on our feet. The angels don't eat or drink, the people of Israel don't eat or drink on Yom Kippur. And he says, these things, not eating or drinking, going barefoot, being cleansed from sin on Yom Kippur, and these things, there's no difference between men and women, and all can resemble the angels in these matters. I just bring that as an aside. It's very typical of Rav Henkin that he's dealing with a real question. He's being respectful of those who came before him and raised an issue. In this case, well, should women dip in the mikveh before Yom Kippur? If that's meant to resemble angels, we have a source that says that angels are somehow male. And Rav Henkin, through a close reading, says, well, maybe angels are somehow male. I can accept that. But clearly, that's not the sense in which we're trying to emulate angels on Yom Kippur, not in anything that has to do specifically with maleness, but rather in the sense that the whole people of Israel, all of Am Yisrael, want to be not eating and not drinking, and in particular cleansed from sin. That's not something that's gendered. And Rav Henkin takes the time to point that out. Well, in any case, at the end of this tshuva, Rav Henkin basically says that he understands that though there's this decree against single women, generally speaking, going to the mikveh, on Erev Yom Kippur, it's permissible because this is an unusual circumstance. It's once a year. We can differentiate between things. He still very carefully says a local rabbi can still prohibit these immersions if he feels it necessary. Rav Henkin, as we'll see in a moment, was very respectful of local authorities. And at the same time, Rav Henkin was inclined to think, particularly for the purpose of tshuva, that would be permissible. Rav Henkin had already done a good amount of my work for me because he had researched this topic and he had discussed the idea of a single woman immersing for the purpose of tshuva. At the same time, you can imagine the pressure one feels in trying to write something that's drawing something very brief, very accessible, that's drawing on an extensive responsum that's written by one supervisor who's about to read what you've written. And I wrote something, and it turned out actually that the halachic content was fine. Wrote about single women being discouraged from immersing, there being permission on Erev Yom Kippur, at least, and that this is different from the case of preparing for mikveh for Nida, and therefore she wouldn't go through the usual preparations, and also mentioning that there are other ways to pursue tshuva that are not only mikveh related. And suggesting that she might talk to a local rabbi. So those halachic elements were all really drawn, or largely drawn from Rav Henkin's tshuva. And I went on in the response with some emotional or spiritual words I thought of as chizuk for the woman. And I overreached. I didn't think I realized it at the time. I was empathizing with her. I had imagined some sort of backstory for this woman. And Rav Henkin wrote, don't assume you know whom it is you are answering. And that's just a line. Like I said, Rav Henkin was careful with words and he used understatement a lot. It was just a simple line. Don't assume you know whom it is that you're answering. It stayed with me forever after that. On the one hand, we want to be compassionate. We want to show empathy. On the other hand, if you don't know someone and you don't know the details of what they're going through, you can't assume that they do. Sometimes even a drive to show empathy can be damaging or misplaced if we assume too much. What we think is empathy can actually be a lack of respect for the idea that there's knowledge about that person that we don't have. And this kind of idea is something that Rav Henkin drove home to us a lot. I'm going to quote some comments from him about different questions. Is that what she means? I don't know what she means. This would be in response to a question where I thought I had interpreted an unclear question correctly, and Rav Henkin was pointing out, well, you don't know. Another point he wrote, I think in principle we have to clarify doubts, or at least to write if, then. And that became our common practice, right? So that when we weren't sure what a woman meant, sometimes we would say, please get back to us to clarify. Sometimes if it was really going to be one of two possibilities, Rav Henkin pioneered that we'd say, if it's this, then it's that. If it's that, then it's the other. And the idea being that we were able to provide solid information without forcing the woman to lay things out a second time unnecessarily. again, respecting the woman and also respecting the limits of our knowledge about her, and of course, respecting halacha. Um, Rav Henkin, I spoke a little bit earlier about Rav Henkin's great sensitivity. So the fact that he wanted us to hold back on empathy when we didn't understand what we were empathizing about didn't mean that we weren't going to be sympathetic. There's a question we had once where this was another one that stayed with me for about 16 years. A woman wrote, "Is it normal to feel extremely stressed on the day one is to go to the mikveh? If so, can you discuss and suggest helpful tips that will establish a better tone and feeling for the house and the mikveh user?" So I wrote something. I did my best. I gave her some advice, and I asked Rav Henkin, "Is this an okay tone, as the Yoetz said, or do I sound too much like Dear Abby? Is it sounding like an advice column?" And he wrote back, "It's fine. She needs a Dear Abby." He didn't stop there, and I changed the word critical to important because I don't want to stress her further. He was there with the woman. We shouldn't overreach, but also sometimes we had to understand or look for what a woman was looking for to the extent possible and be very careful with our wording when we did that. The types quoting comments from him over the years, I changed the first paragraph to make it more sympathetic. Or, quote, I softened the question by changing why this woman needs to why this woman wishes to. Or one time there was a proposed response that used the word need in quotes, like why someone needs something. And he wrote, I would cut out the quotation marks around the word need. Why semi-mock it? These are psychological realities. He was so sensitive to every word the woman wrote and so sensitive to how our words might be perceived by her. And these things went hand in hand again with great humility. It wasn't just humility about what we understood of the questioner, it was humility about other things as well. Dr. Dina Zimmerman, who pioneered the Yoatzot website and remains a supervisor to this day and is one of the first Yoatzot Halacha, once wrote in the notes, you can recommend this book unless Rav Henkin has objections or suggestions. And Rav Henkin very characteristically responds, I can't recommend what I don't know. He wasn't about to say he was going to recommend a book that he hadn't seen, and he wasn't going to pretend he had seen things he hadn't. Or sometimes just telling us we're not obliged to know everything. We should occasionally say things like, we can't speak for the sages, and we do not always know the circumstances and the reasons for a specific enactment. He was very sensitive to what we knew. Or one time a woman wrote in with a note, and she had a problem with something we had written. And I think my initial draft was a little defensive. And Rav Henkin wrote, why don't we simply acknowledge that her point is well taken? Parentheses, she's right, and parentheses. Rav Henkin wanted things to be straight, and he wanted them to be honest. And I learned very quickly working with him, as did any other Yoatzot working with him, that if we spent more time trying to save face than honestly trying to get it right, it wasn't going to work for him. He was working with us because he wanted women to get halachic answers on a high level, and he wanted to develop our halachic knowledge. There was no room for Rav Henkin for ego or self-justification. We had to do our research and do things well. We had to respect local authorities. This is something, pioneering, thinking about the internet. How do you do that? Characteristic quote, you can't just go over the head of her local Rav and ask me, end quote. Had to be really careful. He had great respect for the ideas that there were certain situations that you couldn't assess from afar. We had to know our limits. Also, in terms of taking care with halacha. Halacha was at Rav Henkin's fingertips, but he would look everything up. I know this also because Rav David Sperling, with whom I spoke, preparing this talk, would tell me sometimes he would sit with him when Rav Henkin was responding to, supervising, looking over draft answers to questions, and Rav Sperling would see him never just assume or never just go on his memory. He'd take the books down each and every time. And he'd ask us things like, what makes you so quick to invoke this heter? Or can you provide a source one way or another? This was a funny one. There was once, frequently we'd get these very complicated basic calculation questions, and I would do my best to calculate it, and I'd ask Alana Elsifan, who's an editor who's worked on the website for a very long time, to double check it. One time, Rav Henkin wrote, I second that, Alana. Please double check. He had checked it himself, but he knew that I had looked it over, and he wanted to encourage us. He wanted to encourage us to do the legwork that we could do without him as much as possible, and not just rely on him to be the one who is, God forbid, he should be the one who is being careful. We had to be careful. We had to be precise. He'd say to us again and again, ask her to be more specific about her circumstances. These are quotes. Don't say it would be good to do something if she has to. That's the wrong language. Or don't use the wording you should not wear or do not wear. Use it's best not to wear. You have to be clear. Or I wonder whether the reader will understand what you've written. Or I think you didn't respond to what she asked. Or she asked a simple and direct question. She deserves a similar answer. Rav Henkin had so much experience as a posek, he understood that even when things get very, very complicated, you have to be able to pinpoint what are the problems here? How can I lay out the issues? What do I know? What do I not know? And how am I responding to it? And the wording of the response had to take into account the reader, because if she wasn't going to understand it, we weren't giving her a good response. Rav Henkin was always curious. When questions came up with a medical aspect that he didn't know, he was always asking or interested in Dina's opinion. Dina, are there such cases? How does a physician determine what this is? It wasn't just medical, manicures. I learned very quickly that I couldn't just talk as if I knew exactly how a manicure worked or a particular hair issue worked. This would come up with mikvah sometimes, or a particular type of birth control work. I had to give Rav Henkin very solid, clear, well-researched details before he would even consider looking at what I had written about an issue. Because if you don't know what's going on, you can't bridge the real world with halacha if you don't understand the facts. And he was very, very practical. Again and again, he'd say to us, look, this answer has to be more informative of what she should actually do. Something like, well, can you find out where she lives to help her find a clinic? What is she really saying? Or you shouldn't make general suggestions like that aren't practical. There were all these pinpointed guidelines to how you have to write about halacha that Rav Henkin had learned from his grandfather and exemplified, and some of them are obvious, but even when they sound obvious in the moment, trying to deal with a new question, they're not so obvious. He never lost sight of them, but there was also always the broader sweep of halacha, and every so often he'd also give his precious insights into that. For example, the Talmud has a rule, mikal lav atachomea hein, something that's expressed in the negative, sometimes you can infer the opposite. And Rav Henkin, one time I was trying to phrase something where a woman asked us a question that really wasn't in our area of expertise, but I didn't want her to feel pushed aside or rejected because it was a sensitive issue. And he phrased it for me, talking more about here's what we specialize in, as opposed to saying we can't handle your question. And he wrote, note miklal hana tashomei alav, from us putting it in a positive way, she can infer the negative. And then he added, and note the general circumspection. He was very, very thoughtful, very, very careful, and at the same time, fearless when it came to matters he had researched and that he had concluded were the correct psak or halachic truth. Rav Henkin, like I said before, was always ready to revisit things. This could be something hard to learn when we worked with him. We might have said something a few times and then he might say, well, let's look into that again. I want to double check. There was nothing that was ever closed. Rav Henkin had a passion for halacha. He had a passion for bridging that gap between what was in the books and what was going on for people and the help they needed in their lives. And he was always working on it, and he was always demanding that there would be excellence. I spoke with Rav Henkin before coming here today to speak with you, and she was saying that he wanted us to develop as knowing halacha. His priority in working with us was, of course, that the answer be high quality, that be excellent. When we ourselves displayed excellence, that was when he was happy. He was most satisfied with our work when he saw us pushing ourselves and living up to the standards and the guidelines that he had given us. The way I want to summarize here what I've said tonight is with the message that Rav Henkin gave us when at the very end of his life, he had to retire from the site because it was no longer physically possible for him to work on it. He wrote as follows: 23 years ago, Rav Haftig and I joined with my wife Chana to birth the revolution of Yoatzot Halacha. I look back with thanksgiving to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for the opportunity to have had a formative impact upon Torah life. I have watched you and your fellow Yoatzot grow in Torah stature, sensitivity, and skill, and bring tremendous bracha to Jewish life. I appreciate your learning from Rav Henkin, that's high praise. I appreciate your learning and your devotion to halacha, that's higher. And to Am Yisrael, may you continue in good health during long, blessed years of Torah creativity and service, and raise worthy disciples who will follow in your path. We are all custodians of halacha, with the task of passing on what we have received from our teachers and mentors to those who are the next link in the chain. I pray I have conveyed to you that the integrity of Torah stands above all else, and I trust that in your desire to gladden the hearts of those who turn to you, that you will always be faithful to halacha. Rav Henkin passed on the torch to us, the Yoatzot Halacha. This is the message of the Yoatzot Halacha. The secret of the success of the Yoatzot Halacha, if there is one, is this central message of integrity, of loyalty, of Torah standing above all else, even as we seek to gladden the hearts of people, not losing sight of our best possible grasp on the truth and our commitment to get to it, to reach it. What I'm hoping that maybe we've achieved from our talk tonight is that you too will feel a little bit as though you have been passed that torch, that you, not just from learning from the benefit of the Yoatzot Halacha and their contributions to this conference or in your lives, learning Torah, that not just from there, but also from this message from Rav Henkin, that you'll appreciate that we are all tasked on, we are all given the task of passing on what we've received from our teachers and mentors to the next link in the chain, and that we all are responsible for the integrity of halacha and for growing in Torah as we pursue lives of Torah and Yirat Shamayim and Avat Hashem, lives Bezrat Hashem enriched by our pursuit of halacha and our attempts to bridge the gap between what we see in our lives and what we see in the texts. Thank you so much. May Rav Henkin serve as a guide to us all.